Welcome to the video lecture for the textbook Understanding Project Management, A Practical Guide, 2nd edition. This is Chapter 3, Stakeholder Planning. So as a review, this is the project life cycle again, and we can see that stakeholder planning is now our first step into the planning phase. And it's important to look at and plan for stakeholders initially, like right away. It is a foundational thing. In order to do the rest of planning, you really need to understand who your stakeholders are and what they're about. So that's an important step. Our agenda is, first of all, an introduction to planning. This is our first step into planning, so some overall thoughts on planning. And then 2 questions. What are the characteristics of the stakeholders, and how should we engage with the stakeholders? So that's what we're going to do. Now, introduction to the planning. With the initiating phase complete, the next phase is the planning phase. And you can see all of the different chapters that have to do with the planning phase. There's Chapter 3, Stakeholder Planning first. Well, each of the planning chapters is presented in order. So, in the textbook and in these video lectures, we will be looking at each aspect of planning separately, like stakeholder, scope, schedule, budget, and so on. During real-life projects, decisions made in one area may affect one or more of the others. This is the way it works, and we saw this in Project Constraints in Chapter 1. For discussion, for you to think about, how would budget planning impact the scope and schedule plans? If you were going to plan for increased budget or decreased or a change in your budget, how would that affect? And that it would affect your scope planning and schedule plans. So these plans all interrelate with each other. And so it's not a case when you're planning of just sequentially going through each aspect. You're constantly moving up and down this list in all of the different areas. They all interrelate to each other. Okay, what are the characteristics of the stakeholders? First question. Now, some key project stakeholders were first identified in the project charter. We saw that before. However, there are additional project stakeholders that should and could be identified during planning. We might not know them all initially. And so that's something that should be done at this stage. Now, for each stakeholder, we should be looking to the project manager attempts to identify their level of power, which can be from low to high. Level of power is a stakeholder's ability to affect the project in some way, to change it, to modify it, even cancel it. That's their level of power. As well, their level of interest, of how interested are they, how much are they following what's happening in the project. That can also be low or high. There can be stakeholders that are very, very much tied into the project, and there may be others that are somewhat passive in nature. And finally, their level of support. For each combination of power and interest, stakeholders can be highly supportive. They really want the project to succeed, or they could be of lower support, which would be either neutral or even adversarial. And that's something that we need to understand as part of our analysis of the stakeholders' characteristics. Now, at this stage, we're going to go back to our case study and watch the following video where we will see the project manager, Sophie, run through the various stakeholders that she has identified and attempt to categorize their power, interest, and level of support. So let's watch that video together. After completing the project kickoff meeting, Sophie starts to think about the planning work ahead. There are so many things to start working on. Her first priority is to create a list of all the stakeholders that she is aware of at this point in the project. The company CEO, Casey Serador, is the first name on the list. By nature of her role, Casey has an extremely high level of power. Sophie knows from past experience that Casey's interest level is also high. Casey is a hands-on CEO who is fully engaged in the products of her company and is highly supportive of her employees. Next, Sophie adds Arun Singh to the list. As the project sponsor, Arun has a high level of power. Arun will want this project to be successful and, given the high visibility of this project, he will likely be very interested. Sophie can count on a high level of support from him. There will be 3 additional project teams working on the other DecoCam version 4 program projects: development, installation, and technical writing. Sophie has assessed that each of the project managers will possess a fairly high level of power, as their actions and decisions could positively or negatively affect her project. However, she knows that their primary interest will be in their own projects, and therefore they will have a lower level of interest in hers. In terms of support, Sophie expects that they will be neutral. In conversation with Arun, Sophie becomes aware of a potential issue. Jackson Woodhouse, Vice President of Customer Support, is very upset that his project idea was bypassed in favor of the photo assistant option. Jackson is an important stakeholder, and Sophie will need the cooperation of a number of people in his department. While Sophie feels his power and interest are high, she is worried about whether he will be supportive of her project. She will do her best to gain his support for the project, but she will assume that he will be unsupportive at this point in time. Catherine Bianche is well known. Through working with her on a number of projects, Catherine has become a mentor for Sophie, providing feedback and career advice to her. Sophie knows that her power, interest, and support will be high. At this point, there are no team members assigned to Sophie's project, but she knows that this will be changing soon. Part of the planning process is to identify and acquire the necessary team members to complete the project. For now, she adds project team to her list, knowing that she will be able to fill in the names later. Her project team will have a lower level of power compared to other stakeholders. Their interest should be high, and they should also be supportive. It will become an issue later if there are any uninterested or unsupportive team members assigned to the project. Finally, there will be a number of other employees at Deco Productions who will be involved with or affected by the project. For example, they may provide services for or receive certain outputs of the project. In general, they will have a low level of power and interest, and their level of support will likely be neutral. From past experience, Sophie knows that additional stakeholders will become apparent throughout the project, and as they do, she will add them to her list. For now, this is a good start. Okay, so this we saw the analysis that Sophie went through. You could see that she was assessing each stakeholder, individual or group, and to determine those characteristics of power, interest, and level of support. So she identified the following project stakeholders that you on this list. And there may be others that become apparent as the project proceeds, but for now, this is a good list for her to that she was working on. And please refer to the stakeholder register for the case study in the textbook on page 36, so that you can see the results of that. But you'll see it nicely documented in that document, and that should be kept up to date throughout the project. Project stakeholders, a key idea. Project stakeholders should be identified and analyzed to assess their level of power, interest, and support, right? So, okay, so now we move on to our next step. We're going to go right to the video of creating the stakeholder engagement plan. So let's see what Sophie does now, because it's not enough just to analyze stakeholders, but it's another to say, well, what should we do about it? So let's watch this video together. Sophie considers each of the stakeholders on her list. She asks herself the question, what can I do to effectively engage with them? One of the approaches that has helped her when developing her stakeholder engagement plan is to use empathy to see things from their point of view. Once she does, she can more clearly evaluate their needs and decide how best to approach them.
From her past interactions, she knows that Casey is passionate about the quality of her company's products and, above all, values open and clear communication. Sophie stops and thinks about what it would be like to be the CEO of a company, one that she started. With this insight, she jots down a few ideas, including dropping by Casey's office periodically and being ready for the types of questions she tends to ask. Another stakeholder to consider is Jackson. He may be a challenge for Sophie since his project idea was bypassed in favor of DecoCam version 4, and she is concerned that he may be unsupportive of her project. She thinks about how Jackson would likely feel. He has been with the company for many years and likely feels some level of frustration as well as feeling underappreciated by the company. Based on this, Sophie decides she will seek out his advice during the project and regularly provide positive feedback to his department. She hopes that this will increase his level of support for the project. She continues this process with each of the remaining stakeholders.
Okay, so we saw this process that Sophie was doing, and this is now the answers the question: how should we engage with the stakeholders? So consider part of that is to consider each of the combinations of stakeholder power and interest and how we should approach each combination. So this was the the chart that we had shown before on a previous slide, and we can see there's various combinations and so on. So at this point, I would direct you to chapter 3 of your textbook, page 37, and it talks about the general approaches that are recommended for each combination of power and interest. For example, and it shows you a flow chart that you can follow. But if you have somebody who is, for example, very high power and low interest, for example, this chart will indicate a general approach of meeting the requirements of that stakeholder because they have high power, they have low interest, they just want you to just meet their requirements. You don't have to necessarily go further. On the other hand, a high power, high interest stakeholder, that's probably your most important, your key stakeholders. There is a general approach of pay close attention, right? You should really be focused on them. Really pay attention to those ones. And there are general approaches for the other combinations as well. This isn't the end of it. You need to go into more detail in your stakeholder engagement plan. But this gives you sort of the general approach that you should do in order to, and generally your goal is to increase the level of support. There in most cases, it's normally useful. You may look and say, well, what's my approach with the level of support? How does that play in? Well, in general, the name of the game here is to increase support from unsupportive to neutral to supportive wherever possible, where effective. So that's again page 37 of your textbook, and see the stakeholder engagement plan for the case study. That's on pages 39 to 40. So have a look there to see what in detail Sophie came up with for each of her stakeholders identified in the project. And again, it's going to be based on those general approaches that we talked about before, but goes into more detail. So overall key idea: develop a plan, the stakeholder engagement plan, of how to engage with each stakeholder. This is a key thing that you want to think about, is how are you going to interact with them, right? And that's what the stakeholder engagement plan looks to do. Now, for discussion, these stakeholder documents, the stakeholder register and stakeholder engagement plan, should these be distributed to the stakeholders of the project? Should you send them out? For example, the project charter is distributed. Many of the other documents will be distributed to project stakeholders. Should you? So just think about that for a moment. And the answer is no. in general, keep the stakeholder register and stakeholder engagement plan confidential. You're talking about the categorization, the assessment of people's motives and power and interest and level of support and so on, and how you're going to engage with them. Out of context, that could be received, would not be necessarily received well by some stakeholders. So this is the kind of thing that you keep confidential. You're not distributing this. This is your own personal plan for how you're going to deal with your stakeholders. And it's not something you post on a website or put in an email. That you don't make it public. So that's just a note. This is the one set of documents, these two documents, which you don't want to share. Everything else that we talk about in planning and throughout project management is generally for distribution across the project team and to many stakeholders, but not on these stakeholder documents. So just a note. Your key terminology. Again, see the key terminology, chapter 3 in the textbook for the complete list of terms. But these are the ones that we introduced during this video lecture. Some references from this slide deck, and this is the completion of the video lecture for this chapter.